In the first decade of the 1900s, historian and sociologist Max Weber wrote a series of essays declaring that European and American society were becoming overly rationalized, which is to say that traditions, values, and emotions as motivators and drivers of behavior in society were being replaced with concepts based on rationality and reason. If you watched part 1 of this series, you would already know that. Please do so if you have not and or do not. This is Rationalization Part 2. I'm Daniel Holter, and I am not an expert, just a guy who read some stuff. In part 1 of this series, I shared how Max Weber divided rationality into 4 types: practical, theoretical, substantive, and formal. Weber said that formal rationality is that institutionalized, large-scale standardization and calculation of means to ends based on universally applied rules. It is the domain of bureaucracies, the state, and the explicit and implicit rules of the capitalist economic system. Formal rationality requires these predefined systems of laws or rules to be enforced by what Weber called rational legal authority. That is, individuals granted official dominance within the system, granted power systematically on the basis of what promotes its outcomes and functionality as defined by the system. And how they exercise that authority is on the basis of standardized constraints applied to them in their role. In the case of states, the tools at these authorities' disposal includes the use of violence, taking property, or removing people entirely from the system to preserve its predictability of outcome. Formal rationality is how we willfully or coercively embed individuals in constraining systems for predictable effects at scale. Weber was concerned that the complex of predetermined outcomes and the mechanized systems of attaining them, particularly within the rationalized economic system of capitalism, was itself a prison of sorts, something he called a shell as hard as steel, also often translated as an iron cage. Substantive rationality is the domain of morals, ethics, ideologies, and religious beliefs, how our decisions and behaviors are shaped by values. Value postulates might be developed, supported, or defended using theoretical rationality, but deference to the theoretical could be framed as a substantive rationality itself. And these value postulates become organized into clusters and serve as simple heuristics for schemes of perception or behavior, so that given a choice, we might say, as a Christian, I will do this, or as a feminist, I make sense through this lens, or as a Buddhist, the situation looks this way to me, or even as a friend to whom loyalty and friendship is a core value, I would do this. The modern state, with its emphasis on rational legal authority and impersonal systems of laws, was in large part a shift in substantive rationality, a shift in response to the rigid, unfair hierarchies of feudalism and monarchy, under which authority was traditional, paternalistic, and exploitative of those not lucky enough to be born into positions of influence or domination. But Weber didn't see this as only a shift to new values. He saw the formal rationality being imposed on the basis of these values diminish the role of substantive rationality in society by excessively constraining them within that shell as hard as steel, which constrains both ends and means, as illustrated in part 1 of this series with the story of Sam buying a house, wanting to abide by substantive values-based reasoning, but being restricted due to the constraints of formal processes and the capitalist economic system. It is important to recognize that this isn't a simple story. I painted a rosier picture of traditional authority in part 1, but there are a number of ways we can look at this. The Enlightenment did a lot of good for the world and for people, but according to Max Weber, we may have lost something significant and important in our turn away from substantive rationality and tradition. The values of the Enlightenment, centering individualism, liberty, equality, and empiricism, naturally drove the development of a society whose politics, governance, and institutions were based on impersonal, universally applied formal rationality. But at the same time, according to Weber, another shift in substantive rationality was driving the rationalization of the economic system, which might be even more consequential. In his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber discusses a system of values propagated specifically by the Puritanical Calvinist and other Reformed Protestant churches, which introduced into the culture what he called an ethical peculiarity, which put it at odds with the formerly dominant religion of Catholicism. This peculiarity hinges on a type of theology of the calling, which elevated in a religious sense one's commitment and dedication to a secular occupation. This was something he called inner-worldly asceticism. And it was, according to Weber, the substantive rationality which supported the steep rise of the capitalist economy, which only further rationalized society with its self-perpetuating, capturing formal rationality. In The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber quotes what he calls a sermon from Benjamin Franklin, which exemplifies that puritanical spirit of capitalism in America. In the sermon, Franklin comes across like an early hustle culture influencer, saying, "Remember that time is money. He that can earn 10 shillings a day by his labor and goes abroad or sits idle 1/2 of that day, though he spends but 6 pence during his diversion or idleness, ought not to reckon that the only expense. He has really spent, or rather thrown away, 5 shillings besides. And remember that money is of the prolific generating nature. Money can beget money, and its offspring can beget more, and so on. The more there is of it, the more it produces every turning, so that the profits rise quicker and quicker. He that murders a crown destroys all that it might have produced, even scores of pounds. He that wastes idly a groat's worth of his time per day, one day with another, wastes the privilege of using 100 pounds each day." End quote. And by using, I can only assume Benny F., that early hustle culture influencer, meant investing, which Weber describes as Franklin's ethically slanted maxim for the conduct of life. Calvinists were not big on conspicuous consumption, but a type of secular asceticism which amassed capital and invested it rather than spending on frivolous pursuits. We can note briefly that Franklin was not Calvinist, but a deist who, Weber argues, was fully indoctrinated by his Calvinist father into such an ethical framework. Ben Franklin dedicated about 50% of his parents' headstone epitaph to their industriousness, writing, "Without an estate or any gainful employment, by constant labor and industry, with God's blessing, they maintained a large family comfortably and brought up 13 children and 7 grandchildren reputably. From this instance, reader, be encouraged to diligence in thy calling." End quote. Demonstrated here, perhaps, is how this spirit of capitalism, this inner-worldly asceticism, though originating as a theological substantive rationality, quickly embedded itself as a non-religious moral framework, which rapidly came to dominate American and European culture. Weber describes this spirit of capitalism as an attitude which, in the pursuit of a calling, strives systematically for profit for its own sake in the manner exemplified by Benjamin Franklin, not for subsistence, but for acquisition. Weber contrasts that acquisitive spirit with one he terms traditionalism in economic drive. He points to an interesting economic pattern related to piecework and corn harvesting and how efforts to increase performance by increasing rates per acre of corn harvested surprisingly resulted in people working less. Instead of taking advantage of the opportunity to earn more money for the same amount of work, field workers would actually put in less time to earn the same amount as they had been before, which had already been sufficient to subsist on, and see this increased piecework payment as an opportunity to take back their time. As Weber puts it, the extra money appealed to him less than the reduction in work. Let's note here that this is only going to be the case in conditions where subsistence and basic needs are already being met, highlighting the role that scarcity and desperation play in a capitalist economy. So this is a peculiar topic to try and unpack in our current culture because what Weber describes as the spirit of capitalism is alive and well and all around us. It is very much the water that we swim in. I was certainly raised to have a good work ethic, to do an excellent job at everything I was employed to do, and that ethic is reinforced in most social contexts. I internalized that this is an attribute that makes a person good. That is, it is primarily the substantive sort of rationality. But I was also raised by a father who owns a construction company who, as far as I was made aware, kept his company at just the size he needed to support his family. There were no aspirations of pushing to make it enormous and more profitable than it was purely for acquisitive purposes. There was a balance to be struck, and entrepreneurial aspiration ended at the point of subsistence. What this speaks to, I think, is a competing substantive rationality, one that aligns much more closely with what Weber called traditionalism, which sees living an enriched and connected life both inside and outside of work as a good thing and far less destructive than the it's not personal, it's just business style surrender of the moral locus of control. Contrast the traditional modest aspirations of entrepreneurs to own just one small business sufficient to support without subsuming versus the modern American dream of franchise, scale, licensing, and distribution deals with major conglomerates, or getting your app bought out by a giant tech company, which might just be the first chapter in becoming a serial entrepreneur. I have always respected those who at a modest scale of earning put the priority on the things that they personally value, like time with loved ones, enjoying and creating, art, personal projects and pursuits, protecting these things from the values imposed by institutions. But this is an ethic which is very much at odds with what Weber calls the spirit of capitalism. So my dad's approach to business brings to mind another interesting theological difference between puritanical and reformed churches like Calvinism and what Weber called traditional religions, which is relevant here because my parents actually belonged to one of those traditional Christian religions, Eastern Orthodoxy. I was raised Orthodox, and there are a few theological aspects of that faith which set it, along with Catholicism, in stark contrast to the dogma of Reformed Protestant churches. The principle of sola fide, which translates to faith only or faith alone, was introduced by Martin Luther. The principle is that humans can be saved only through faith in Jesus Christ and nothing else. People should be good, abiding by Scripture, sure, but in reality, according to church doctrine, nothing they do actually moves the needle on prospects for salvation. Things get a little weird when you get into the deterministic aspects of Calvinism, and in the Protestant ethic, Weber spends a significant amount of time navigating that and how it relates to that drive for inner-worldly asceticism. In the Protestant ethic, Weber repeatedly cites John Bunyan's 1678 book, The Pilgrim's Progress, an early Protestant allegorical devotional about an everyman named Christian who abandons his wife and children on a quest for salvation, weighed down with a burden of sins on his back. Comment threads on the internet even today showcase the clarity of this book's anti-Catholic theology, and Orthodox Christians can be found declaring it thoroughly unorthodox. There's a character in the book who believes he can be saved through good works, and he literally fails to take the correct path to the city of salvation, and oh yeah, his name is Ignorance. Traditional Christian churches like Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism have strong spiritual ascetic traditions, which they believe to effectively purify the mind and spirit. And purification is necessary for theosis, or deification, to be united with God. This extends to traditions of monasticism, which Reformed churches have viewed in a very negative light since the days of Luther and Calvin. Monasticism proves an excellent illustration of the Reformed Church's focus. They believed that presence and participation in society and its secular institutions, while abiding by the teachings of the Bible, were of central importance. These acts didn't make you more likely to be saved, because salvation is by faith alone, but they did seem to imply that righteous people just lived in this manner rather than hiding away somewhere as monastics or engaging in practices that had no effect on soul or salvation and contributing nothing to society. As Weber put it, God willed the social achievement of the Christian because it was his will that the social structure of life should accord with his commands and be organized in such a way as to achieve this purpose. Calvinism also had divergent views on good works and how we treat the poor and destitute, with Catholicism emphasizing charity, fair wages, and social justice as it continues to today, and leveling critiques against capitalism for its incompatibility with those things. Calvinism saw success in business as a sign of godliness, and doesn't success in business require one to be calculating in how they set wages. So the capitalist economy becomes the operating system within which righteousness is demonstrated. It is precisely that arena which Theodore Roosevelt said the man is in his famous speech, "The Man in the Arena." And how that operating system affects or shapes or rewards or punishes people is actually just a reflection of their righteousness. If people are poor or destitute, it might actually be an outcome of their lacking goodness or morality or a sufficient work ethic, or whether they were even trying to crush it. And there was a reduced theological or ethical basis in the Reformed Christian Church for people to feel compelled to dedicate time or resources towards those less fortunate / less righteous. Such pursuits are not remotely described by the spirit of capitalism, according to Weber. I feel it is self-evident how the common adoption of such a paradigm creates fertile ground for the capitalist economy to thrive. So I see the modern Broicism movement and its symbiotic relationship with exploitative hierarchies and hustle culture as a good example of how substantive and formal rationalities interact. This is not a critique of Stoicism, the philosophy, which can be very beneficial to some. It is simply to point out how individuals seeking financial gain within a capitalist system exploit the financial aspirations of others, which are tied by this lingering spirit of capitalism to a sense of self-worth, by selling them philosophies which drive those individuals into behaviors which, coincidentally, minimize self-advocacy, which is bad for hierarchies and bad for capitalism, and encourage them to simply accept and commit to uncomplaining labor under the promise that if they are only good and disciplined and ascetic enough in their pursuit of secular goals, this is going to help them climb the hierarchical ladder, supporting and strengthening the formal rationality of the system rather than questioning it. I see interesting parallels between Weber's critiques of Calvinism and how the modern Stoic movement, having eschewed what the original Stoics thought about material gain, drives people to adopt an ethic of unquestioning labor. If it is hard, then that is, as Jocko might say, good. I'm going to call part 2 here at this point. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to getting to a lot of the stuff I said I was going to get to in this part. I want to focus on the self-reinforcement of capitalism next, but also I've been reading some good stuff from James C. Scott, and I still have to get to McDonaldization, and I've already prepared a lot on the subject of disenchantment, which I'm excited to share. So see you next time, whenever that is.